Belmont Suicide Prevention Virtual Workshop. The purpose of this workshop is to provide insight into the social, cultural, and economic changes that have contributed to the uptick in the suicide. The second purpose is to provide critical resources for prevention. I have with me today, I have Melanie McSwain, Executive Director of the Mental Health Association of Cleveland County, Vonda Bryant, Mental Health and Suicide Prevention Advocate, and Andrew Schreck, Regional Director of Community Operations for Partners Behavioral Health Management. We will hear from the presenters right now, and after that, we'll open up for questions and discussions. So we'll first start off with Melanie. After the three presenters do their presentation, then we open up for questions and discussions. And this workshop will also be recorded on the cityofbelmont.org website. So if you will go ahead and start with your part, Melanie. Melanie, did you hear me?
Yes, thank you, Zip. I'm hearing a bit of an echo, so let me know if that's coming across on you guys' end.
Yeah, I'm hearing a little bit of the echo.
Yeah, I think see if it still does it. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and, well, I'm still echoing. I'm not sure if somebody needs to mute. Let me see. Didn't think so. Yep. Thank you. Okay. Is that better now? All right. Sorry about that, guys. I think I tried to log into the live stream first before the presenter window, so hopefully we'll be good now. Yeah, as it mentioned, I'm the director for the Mental Health Association of Cleveland County. So I usually primarily focus in Cleveland County, but I'm also a QPR suicide prevention instructor. So I've really dove into a lot about suicide prevention over the last 6-7 years or so. And Zip, when he talked to me, asked if I could really start this off talking about suicide right now, and as we're all dealing with COVID, and how COVID has affected suicide rates and everyone with your risk of suicide. I will say before I get into how suicide ideation may have been affected by COVID, that overall, before we even found ourselves in this situation, the rates of suicide were rising dramatically in the U.S. Since 2001, the suicide rate in the U.S. has risen over 30%. When I started doing suicide prevention trainings, when I was going through the instructor training for QPR back in 2013, I remember looking at the statistics that suicide at that point was the third leading cause of death for youth. And it only took a couple of years. I left the area for a while, and then when I came back, the statistics had already changed to suicide was the second leading cause of death for adolescents. And so, I mean, that in and of itself is alarming and something to pay attention to. And that was even before we found ourselves dealing with a worldwide pandemic. And the way that suicidal ideation and COVID kind of go hand in hand, one of the things that I always want to point out to people is that suicide is always multi-determined. There's never just one thing that will lead someone to contemplate or make an attempt at suicide. There's always a combination of risk factors that come into play, whether that's a history of mental illness, a history of trauma, extreme stressors in someone's life, the culture that you might be from. It's just a number of risk factors that come into play into someone's life. And as I say that too, I just want to focus on the fact that suicide is also, it's not a disease in and of itself. Something I really like to focus on so that it feels like something we can actually tackle and do something about is focusing on the fact that suicide in and of itself is a symptom and a signal that something is wrong. It's not that somebody gets suicide. It's not an illness that someone deals with. It's a signal that something is not going right in our brains, or that we're feeling an overwhelming amount of pain or overwhelm in our life, and that someone is looking for a way to end that pain. And when that comes to, when we find ourselves in a situation like we're all living in right now, which is a situation that absolutely no one was prepared for. We've never been through this before. Seemingly everyone's life overnight changed. I remember, gosh, back in March now, which I can't believe it's been that long ago now, but just hearing the announcements that we were going into lockdown and thinking, okay, we need to run to the grocery store. We might need to be like hunkered down for just a little while where we can't go out. And overnight it went from life as usual to literally everything we do is difficult. And whether through this whole situation you're someone who's dealt with job loss or potentially the loss of a loved one, or you're working, in a frontline position where you've had to continue working through all of this, like no matter what your situation is, even if you haven't dealt with that level of added stress and trauma during this time, for everyone, things that used to not be difficult are now difficult. So overnight we went from, I can go to the grocery store and not think about it, to I'm going to go to the grocery store and I'm going to worry about if my health's going to be okay by just running this routine errand. Or as far as with our jobs, if we are lucky enough to have not had our jobs affected, then now we're trying to figure out, okay, how do I still do my job when I can't be directly with my coworkers? How do I suddenly switch to doing everything online or everything virtually? And everything that we do has just become difficult. Or I'm trying to work from home while also taking care of my kids while I'm at home. And those two things just cannot happen simultaneously. So overall, it's just an increasing level of stress for everyone. And what can happen? One of the major risk factors for suicidal ideation is a history of trauma, and whether that's what is sometimes referred to as the little t traumas, which might be the cumulative effect of being exposed to stressors over a long period of time, or a history of the bigger T traumas that we think of more, such as a history of child abuse or the loss of a child or loss of a loved one. When we're living through something like a worldwide pandemic, some of the previous traumas that we've had in our lives can be re-triggered just by default of living in a state of kind of hypervigilance, where everything we do, we have to think about. And another piece of that as well, in recent years, I've really gotten more into, and I know there's been a lot more talk about trauma and the nervous system and the brain. And I really like how that ties into topics of suicide and mental health, because we all have nervous systems, we all have brains, and we all have mental health. And that's something I really want to focus on as well, is because a lot of times we just view mental health through the lens of mental illness. And then so if someone hasn't had a history of being diagnosed with a mental illness, then things might be missed, because we don't think of, well, we still need to be mindful of our mental health. And that's why a lot of times you might have people that know someone who's died by suicide, and they think, I had no idea. I mean, there were no risk factors. They didn't have anything, they didn't have a mental illness that I knew of. And the reality is, you don't have to have a mental illness or be dealing with that to experience suicidal thoughts. That is absolutely a risk factor, that if you're somebody who's living with a form of mental illness, whether that's depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, whatever it might be, that definitely increases your risk factors. But if we're not all mindful of our mental health, then we could miss it when something happens in our life that pushes us to that point of feeling like there's no way out. And that's what can happen with our nervous systems in a situation like this, where we're feeling cumulative overwhelm on a daily basis. We're all human beings, we all have nervous systems, and we can all be overwhelmed and overloaded. One of the things that's talked about with trauma and the nervous systems as well is the fact that our nervous system developed thousands upon thousands of years ago, when we were living in a much different world as human beings. Our bodies and our nervous systems are equipped to deal with very tangible threats. So most people have heard of the fight or flight response when it comes to a threat. And so that might be something like, many, many years ago, there might be a tiger that we were facing, or some wild animal that we were facing, that in that short span of time and in that moment, that was a very tangible, immediate danger. And then in that moment, we decide, are we going to flee? Are we going to fight? What are we going to do? But those were limited. Those were times of extreme stress, and then we would be out of that extreme stress. Well, now we have the same nervous systems. We don't have the same type of stressors. So our nervous systems are still trying to figure out, well, what do I do with these things that feel like very tangible threats, when it's, how do I continue to feed my family if I've lost my job? How do I stay safe in a situation where I don't know what I can do that is safe anymore? It feels like there's kind of danger everywhere. Our bodies are trying to figure out how to process that. And what can happen in some instances is we still have those mechanisms in our brain that say, well, I want to fight or I want to flee, but I want to do something to get to safety and get out of this situation. But if we're in a situation where it feels like danger constantly, then sometimes that might look like thoughts that pop up that say, I just need to get out, and I need to end it. I need to escape from this situation. I have nowhere to turn. And that's just something to be aware of when we're all living in a circumstance of increased stress, increased possibility for trauma. It's a circumstance where no matter what your risk factors were before we found ourselves in this situation, everyone's risk factors are now cumulatively increased because of this situation. And I don't want to take anything away from any other speakers, so I'll not go too long on this, but it's just, as I said, I just want to focus on everyone being aware that these are thoughts that can happen to anyone. Suicidal thoughts don't discriminate. It's also not a character flaw. It's not a moral failing. Like I said, it's a signal that something needs to be addressed, and that an individual needs help in that moment and needs a lifeline and someone to help them see out of whatever their current situation is at the time that they feel like they can't get out of. One example that I use to kind of describe it, I try to use a lot of medical terms because we all know that we have physical health and we all pay attention to our physical health. But the thing is, we cannot have overall health without mental health. But one way I try to frame suicidal thoughts that might come up is like if you have a fever. So if you're dealing with a fever, and fevers can be mild or they can be life-threatening, but if you have a fever, it is a signal that your body's fighting something, whether that's an infection somewhere in your body or you've picked up a virus or whatever it is. It's a signal that something needs to be addressed and needs to be looked at. And for me, that's really how I view, suicidal thoughts that might come up, or ideation. It's a signal that something's going on that needs to be addressed. And they can be not as serious, where they can be more passing, it'd just be nice if I didn't wake up tomorrow. Or they can be to the point of life-threatening, where someone's really been thinking about it for a while and has actually developed a plan. But either way, it's something that absolutely is a sign for someone to get help, whether that's talking to a family member or a loved one, calling one of the suicide prevention lifelines or crisis text lines, going somewhere if you find yourself to the point where you already have a plan. But it's not something to keep to yourself. And that's the other thing I just want to mention too, is that a lot of times people, if you're having those thoughts, it's extremely difficult to say anything to someone else, because there is so much stigma and judgment still in our society around suicide, that oftentimes someone, if you're having those thoughts, you want to tell someone and you want to be able to talk to someone about that, but it's terrifying, because there's the fear of, well, if I let somebody know that I'm having these thoughts, then they're not going to trust me anymore. They're not going to think I'm a competent person anymore. They're not going to come to me for advice or anything. They're going to think I'm crazy. And on the flip side, if there's somebody in your life that you are concerned about or worried that they might be having suicidal thoughts, then a lot of times fear, once again, keeps people from saying anything or asking them if they're having thoughts of hurting themselves. And I mean, I experienced this before I learned more about it, is the fear that if you're concerned about someone, then if you say something to them about it, if you ask them about it, and maybe if they weren't already thinking about it, then they're going to think about it and you're going to put the idea in their head. And I just want to really reiterate that research has been done over and over, and they have found that asking someone if they are thinking of suicide, if they're thinking of hurting themselves, absolutely does not increase risk. All it does is decrease risk. It lowers that anxiety that someone might be feeling. It allows them to share that secret that they were holding, and it allows them to share that burden a bit. And for a lot of individuals, just that act alone of being able to talk to someone about it in a non-judgmental way, or that they're going to be able to talk to in a non-judgmental way, can lower anxiety enough for someone to where they can see a little bit maybe out of their current situation and then be willing to seek help. So like I said, I don't want to take up too much time. So since I'm going first, I want to make sure everybody else has plenty of time to say their piece. And I'm of course here to respond to any questions or anything like that. But just a brief overview of how, everything about the situation that we're all finding ourselves in right now can lead to increased incidences of suicidal thoughts and ideation.
And we'll hold off. Thanks, Melanie. That was very helpful. And if anybody have any questions, we'll hold them to the end of the session. And next we hear from Vonda Bryant. Is she Vonda?
Can you
go ahead, Vonda?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. My name is Vonda Bryant, and I am a mental health and suicide prevention advocate. I sit on the state board of NAMI, the National Alliance on Mental Illness. I am a volunteer with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention, Mental Health America of Central Carolinas. I'm also a certified QPR and suicide prevention instructor, also a mental health first aid certified instructor for youth, and I am a North Carolina peer support specialist. But more importantly, I am a 25-year suicide survivor, and 25 years ago, on February 14th, 1995, I almost took my own life. And if it hadn't been for a true hero, my Aunt Kelly, I would not be here. One of the things to piggyback off what the young lady said before me is that suicide is something that is a lot of stigma behind it, but it's also the most preventable death of all deaths. And also, I will say, you have to take culture into account when you're dealing with people with mental health issues and are suicidal. You cannot assume because someone is white that our beliefs are the same as someone white or any other ethnic group. But one thing I will say about ethnic groups and people of color, we all pretty much feel the same. It's a sign of weakness. You're either crazy, pray about it, or give it to God. I wrote a blog for NAMI 3 years ago called "You Can't Pray Away a Mental Health Condition." They said they're one of their most popular blogs to date because of the fact that I go all the way back through our history as African Americans and talk about how we suffered trauma. We have bipolar, depression, anxiety, and that didn't stop just because we came to the United States. It actually increased. So you have to take into account someone's culture when you're dealing with them. And that was so important to me that when I started training online in QPR, suicide prevention training, I reached out to the Institute and I told them, I said, the way this training is set up, y'all are not addressing culture. And if you have white instructors, for the most part, they are not going to elaborate on culture and how we feel. So myself and 2 other African-American females, we worked together over the summer, and we came out with another part of QPR that says culture matters. For instance, when you look at culture, African-Americans, it's about praying and not being viewed as weak. The same thing as Hispanics and Asians. But you have some cultures, like in the Native American culture, they don't use the terminology suicide. They will say, I'm going to meet the Great Spirit in the sky. So it is very important when you're dealing with people of color that you know about their background, you know about how we feel about mental health. Because 25 years ago, when I went in that psychiatric hospital, the first thing my mother said was, you just need to be stronger. And that is a rally cry for most people of color. Since I have been training QPR, one of the things that I have noticed is the fact that this training opens up for people to be more comfortable with suicide because are all not comfortable, but knowing how to help someone. I notice with people who I've trained that a lot of them have lost loved ones. So I always acknowledge at the beginning of the training, you know, if you've lost someone to suicide or if you're a survivor, so you put them a little bit more at ease. And the emails that I have gotten from training people have kept me going, from letting me know that some of them have lost people to suicide. And now since they have and taken the training, they recognize the signs or they feel more comfortable approaching someone who might be suicidal. But for me, you know, 25 years ago, because of the way I was raised, because of the way our culture is, with pray about it, don't claim it, give it to God, it almost killed me. And we have to do a better job of having those conversations about mental health and knowing our history. Because while I was in the psychiatric hospital, I also found out my mom was like, well, depression runs in our family. And I was shocked because it almost killed me. So we have to do a better job of having these conversations so it will normalize mental health, because words hurt and words can help people. And for instance, my grandson is in the 3rd grade and they're doing a lot of their training online right now. So they're doing school online. And his teacher on Monday was sitting up calling people crazy. She was like, well, crazy this, crazy that, I'm a crazy old lady, stuff like that. And my grandson got very upset. He got very upset. So he was like, Nana, we need to talk to my teacher about what she's saying because those words aren't nice. And sure enough, yesterday, we had the conversation with the teacher about those words and how they can hurt and how they can help. And she said that she would make a conscious effort to not to do that. And of course, with my grandson, he's going to make sure. Also, a mental health condition has no face, as it was said in the young lady who spoke earlier. It has no face and it doesn't discriminate. A lot of people think that people with mental health issues are the ones walking the streets and talking to themselves. They don't realize if they got help, they could be okay too. And one of the things that I do here in Charlotte, and I really love doing, is Chief Putney has me speaking to the rookie officers of CMPD, and I've been doing it now for probably over 3 years. And when I walk in that room, I'm dressed up, I look very nice, and the first thing I ask the officers is, how many of y'all would know from looking at me that I have depression? They're all shaking their heads. And the next thing I ask them is, how many of y'all would know because of my depression, I almost died by suicide 25 years ago? And they're shaking their heads. They wouldn't know. You cannot be judgmental. That training, you cannot be judgmental and assume because someone lives in a nice house, or they're a star athlete, or they make good grades, or they have a good-looking family, or they live in a certain part of town. You cannot assume that, hey, how in the world can you be depressed? How can you be suicidal when you have all the material things? But a mental health condition does not care. As many times that I go in the gym and I go in there to work out, I'm very much a social butterfly. A lot of people know who I am. And they'll say, hey, Fonda, how are you doing today? And I'll say, fine. Behind that smile, there's a lot of pain. They don't know that 15 minutes earlier, I was sitting out there in the car crying, trying to will myself to get out of the car. If you saw me, I'm athletic. You can tell that I work out. But if some days I don't feel like brushing my teeth, I don't feel like combing my hair, I don't feel like taking a shower because it takes too much energy. And when I'm sitting out there in the car, my arms feel like they weigh 150 pounds apiece. So people need to realize that mental health is real. And I think since this pandemic has started, people are starting to see what a lot of advocates and mental health organizations have been saying, that it's real. You know, because the thing is, you think about it. When the coronavirus first came into the United States and Washington State, you know, everybody said, well, you know, we're going to lose some lives. Some people are going to die. But no one knew it was going to change the whole way that we live, you know, from putting masks on to social distancing to isolation to the uncertainty to here I am, a big college fan. My son played and we can't go to the game. You know, we were supposed to be going up Saturday for them when they were going to play Notre Dame, and, you know, it's bad enough we can't go in the stadium, but at least we were going to get to go and sit across the street and have like a thing with the fans. But some of the players from Notre Dame have the virus now, have tested positive, so that game is canceled. You look up, you see all these college football games being canceled, and you really wonder, are we going to finish the college football season? And it's every morning when you wake up, whether you had anxiety before, you have it now. Because every morning you wake up, you're like, oh my God, what's going to be next? Every time you look up, something is next. Something is next. And not only that, let's bring in what is going on with racism in this country. That has always been a factor for African Americans and directly affects our mental health. But think about what's going on, that every time we cut the television on, there's a killing of an unarmed African American who's been shot to death and killed by the police or somebody, and nothing is done. Just like with what happened yesterday with Breonna Taylor. I was not surprised that there were not charges brought against the officers. But just think about the domino effect that it's doing to people of color and black women, who we already have to sit up and get out here and deal with how people look at us in society, how black men look at us, and how people look at us in general. And now we feel like we're not protected at all. So you got to take in all of these factors when it comes to mental health. But certain cultures deal with it differently just because of the things like police brutality, racism, social economics are not even, education's not even. It's like we started a race and we were held back where other races ran ahead of us. And it is very hard and it's very frustrating. So again, when you look at mental health, when you look at suicide, you have to look at it through a lens of looking at every single culture, because every culture is different. The Asian culture has a very high rate of suicide because they're high achievers. The Indian culture is very hard to deal with sometimes as far as helping them, because they don't even want to talk about mental health. So again, you have to take culture into account when you're helping people with mental health and suicide. And I'm very proud that I'm still here. It's a struggle every day, but it's a race that I'm planning on winning. But I want people to know that it's always hope, there's always help, and we can recover. And I don't think that's something people realize enough of, is that we can recover, but we're going to have to put in the work. There's no magic pill. There's no magic word that the therapist is going to say that's going to open the skies and everything's going to be okay. You know, therapy is a tool. Medication's a tool. But the two biggest things that help us the most are self-care, knowing our triggers, knowing our boundaries, knowing who to put in our life, knowing who to bring into our life, knowing who to put out, eating right, exercise, and then another big piece, having that support, that person that you know that you can call at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, hey, I'm struggling, and they're not looking at the phone and saying, oh my God, here's Fonda calling me again. She's just feeling sorry for ourselves. Someone asked me one time when I was driving for Uber, they said, what is the best way to help someone with a mental health condition? I said, get educated, get educated. And the last thing I will say is, again, treat people with empathy, compassion, and kindness, because you never know what someone is going through. And it could be a big difference between helping someone get through a bad day or pushing someone over the edge. And I think we don't do enough of that. We don't have natural affection, and we need to do better by each other. So I appreciate that, for letting me have to be able to speak, and hopefully people will hear what we're saying and not be ashamed to get help, but also treat people better.
Okay, thanks, Vonna. That was very, very, very good. And now we're trying to hear some solutions and some ways to get help. And we'll be hearing now from Andrew, who's going to talk about resources that will be available to the public.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay. So what I'm going to do is, because we're going to talk about resources, I'm going to share my screen, and I provided a PowerPoint just because I think after speaking, it's always nice to have something to go back to if folks are curious. And so my feeling is I think we're going to send that PowerPoint to those who want to have it just as a reference. So let me share my screen and make sure you guys are able to see that okay. All right, I think you guys can see it. Again, Zip asked me to talk a little bit about some of the resources here locally in Gaston County. So what I like to do when I talk about behavioral health resources is let folks know that it's not just a one particular resource or one particular option that's available. Services operate on a continuum that goes from least restrictive or invasive to more restrictive. So you think of, a lot of folks either think of either going to an office to kind of do counseling or seek medication, or they look at a hospital intervention. And honestly, there's a lot of in between. And when I talk to folks about what's out in the community and what's out and available for services, folks are surprised that there are as many as there are. And so today I just wanted to provide just a real brief overview of some of the services that are available for folks who are struggling And this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but it's a pretty good overview, high-level overview. So, one of the things that folks often forget or overlook is support groups. And those are folks, that are going through similar issues. And what I've found, even as a professional, it is sometimes more powerful to connect with folks that are going through similar issues, be it divorce or loss, than it is necessarily to talk to a therapist. It really depends on where you are in your journey and what feels right to you. But there are multiple support groups for a variety of things that can be going on. We can talk a little bit further about what all is available. But also there's individual and group counseling and medication management. One of the things that's pretty interesting here in Gaston County is Caremont's integrating a lot of their physician family practices with a therapist. So, even going to your family doctor, you can connect with the therapist really easily. We have things that are called walk-in services where you don't really need an appointment. You can just walk in and they can help assist you. If things are getting challenging and you feel like you're really needing some help now, we have something called mobile crisis, where folks, a therapist can come out and meet you wherever you are out in the community and sit down and talk and try and work through what's going on and connect you to services. And then we certainly have things like a facility-based crisis and hospital that can provide more intensive treatment if need be. We also have similar services in array for children as well. And even though we talk about suicide and the presumption is really that's an adult issue, we also need to be aware that children and adolescents certainly struggle with suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety as well. So they have very similar services, but there are some that are unique. In Gaston County, they have what we call child or school-based therapy in every school, and we have a variety of providers that assist with that. So kids can see a counselor at school, and that helps with transportation and ease of access. They also have something called day treatment that is sort of a combination of the school as well as pretty intensive treatment for behavioral health issues. One of the things I also like to point out is we have a lot of services that you can access, but there's often several services out there and resources that we often overlook. As a counselor, usually besides your family, folks tend to reach out first to their family doctor or their pastor. And so it's important to know that your doctors, your pastors, a lot of those folks can certainly sit down, talk with you, and either assist you outright or connect you to services. So oftentimes family doctors now are much more comfortable working with mild to moderate depression and anxiety. A lot of pastors, as part of their divinity degree, do counseling training. And are often the first folks that people go to for grief and loss or marital counseling. Schools offer a great deal of services as well, beyond just the what we call embedded therapists. They have school counselors and psychologists that can assist. For many people, one thing that is often forgotten or overlooked is what we call employee assistant programs. And these are services that you're often through your human resource department that you can access. And what makes this really, you're already kind of have these available. And what they can do is provide you with, for counseling's sake, free counseling services. And it's usually brief therapy, somewhere between 3 and 6 counseling appointments, but they're free. And oftentimes it's a good way to just get to access services without having the burden of insurance and co-pays. We also, as I mentioned earlier, have community support groups. Hospice is also, they provide a lot of the support groups, but also counseling in and around grief as well as others. And then certainly you can look at our partners website. That website has a lot of resources ranging from a wide variety of behavioral health issues and concerns, as well as training. So I think today you've heard a couple of different trainings mentioned, QPR and I think some allusion to what we call CIT training, which is for first responders to assist in engaging behavioral health crises and connecting folks to resources. But there are a lot of trainings that are open to the public that you're more than welcome to do. You can also look at mental health first aid, which is really to how can I help somebody, family member or friend who may be dealing with some mental health crises or just concerns. We are talking about suicide today, so it would be remiss if I didn't mention the Lifeline, and this is a national suicide prevention lifeline. It is free. It's available 24/7, and you can be anonymous. And it's again, I think both the presenters before me indicated how challenging it can be to just open up and talk to someone, and sometimes just calling a number to have somebody talk to anytime is that first step to really assisting in getting treatment that maybe would be helpful. Something that has come up rather recently, and I know we've talked about the stress of COVID. Certainly I know our family has experienced that. North Carolina came up with 2 hotlines. Both are free, anonymous, and available 24/7. It's really to help you handle the stressors that's really taking hold of, I think, all of us here with COVID. And the first is called Hope4NC, and you can see the number there. And that's for anybody that feels like they could benefit from just talking to somebody and maybe connecting them to some resources wherever they live. It's free, and again, it's really to help North Carolinians manage the increased burden on our anxiety and stresses with COVID. They also have a unique line just for those that are in the helping profession called Hope4Healers. And they've actually expanded this. This initially was for healthcare workers and first responders, but they saw the need and the impact that school staff have in dealing with the COVID responses, and certainly trying to be on the front lines from a education standpoint. So they have this helpline, and it is geared for folks specifically to assist those kind of on the front lines of COVID and provide them some support. So we've talked a little bit about all the different options and services and availability. And one of the things I also want to tell folks is, as we talk about suicide and behavioral health crises, you're always welcome to call 911. And I know Melody actually is one of the folks that is involved in what we call CIT trained law enforcement and EMS folks. And what they do is they help train police and first responders, even 911 operators on behavioral health emergencies and how to really engage and connect folks. And they can also send out mobile crisis, which is, again, a therapist that can meet an individual struggling with behavioral health crisis and really connect them to services. Certainly we have our partners Access to Care line, 1-888-235-4673. And again, we have licensed clinicians available 24/7 to talk and help you in the moment, but also to help connect you to resources out nearest you. One of the things I also talk about is, although Partners is focused on those who are uninsured or have Medicaid, if you have insurance, and this is actually my personal card, insurance card, if you flip it on the back, oftentimes you'll see a line specific to mental health or behavioral health that you can call. And most insurance companies have folks that are staffing those lines that can connect you to services, and they can figure out exactly what you need and what's most convenient for you based on where you live or where you work. And then certainly this is our access to care line number. Again, you're welcome to reach out to that. You're welcome to look at our website to see any services or trainings or any kind of information related to behavioral health that may be helpful for you in the moment or for a loved one. And so with that, I will close that off and step back, and happy to answer any questions folks may have.
Okay, we're going to open up for questions, and we really thank Melody, Vonda, and Andrew for their presentations. And if anybody wants to ask questions, we'll be able to answer them. So you can text 980-825-41444. I'll go to swiftpoland.com and enter 15671. And for the panel, I do have a question. With the clinics and everything shut out now and you can't actually get in, how would they be able to access somebody for mental health?
So I'll be happy to answer that. A lot of our providers, at least in our network, they're both, most of them are open still, and they have access through telehealth. So you can talk to them via your phone, your computer, and still receive services. But that being said, most providers that I am aware of also are doing some face-to-face as well if you prefer. But the access and services are still available. They just may be through telehealth or kind of what we're doing here with Zoom.
Do you want, I'll pick up this question I see here. I'm not sure if Fonda can see the questions that are coming in. A question was asked, do you think it is easier for someone to share their feelings and temptations about suicide with a family member or a friend instead? I'm assuming this means instead of actually contacting like the Suicide Prevention Lifeline or a therapist. And I think it depends on the situation. One thing I try to encourage when we're talking about suicide prevention is truly focusing on prevention, that we're able to have these conversations with friends and family before we're at a point of crisis. This should be something that we're talking about within our families, and with friends. Fonda mentioned it, but if you can find a friend that you know, this is somebody who is a non-judgmental support in my life that I know I can share when I'm going through a difficult time and I'm not doing okay, that I can share with them, and they're going to be there for me, and they're not going to judge me. I encourage people to go ahead and preemptively have those conversations with your friends and family, someone in your life that you know, that you can make a pact with one another to promise one another that, I might not be at this point right now where I'm at a low point and I might be having some of those thoughts, but I recognize that it can happen and that it can happen to anyone. So I want you to know, as your friend, that please come to me if you ever have any of these thoughts. Let me know, and I promise you that I will let you know. And go ahead and have those conversations and make that pact before you're in a crisis situation, because when you're in a crisis situation, everything is elevated. Fears are elevated, and a lot of times it can be, especially for families, if you haven't preemptively had these conversations, it can be a lot more difficult to ask someone you're extremely close with if they're thinking about suicide, because your own fears come into play about, what if they do something? What if I lose them? So go ahead and have those conversations and get that set up, so if I find myself in crisis, I know who I can go to. And then another thing that I always recommend is we give out the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and the Crisis Text Line as an avenue for people to reach out to if they themselves are having thoughts. But another thing you can do is, if there's a loved one that you're concerned about, but you're not sure how to address it, you don't know how to talk to them, you can contact those lines yourself and talk to a counselor and ask them what you should do or how to handle the situation. Or if there's, a family member or friend, you can stay with them or sit with them while they make that phone call or they reach out. And I wanted to make sure we mentioned the crisis text line as well. It's 741-741. You can just text 741-741 and be connected to a crisis counselor. I know it's a lot easier. I know I tend to prefer text over talking on the phone, so that is an option for somebody to text that in. And if there's, I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything to that answer.
Yeah. I would like to add something about family and friends. In the QPR training, we say ask, before because again, I'm going back to culture, because again, 25 years ago, I couldn't reach out to my mother. I felt like I couldn't reach out to any family member, because again, when you look at culture, and it's so thick with religion and the fact that we're strong, we came through slavery, we don't have those problems. It might be very difficult for someone to reach out and speak to someone in their family. And not just that, it's just the view of suicide, again, that you're weak, you're selfish, you're crazy. So it is very hard sometimes, but I urge you, if you have someone in your family that you can reach out to, like I had my Aunt Kelly, who, again, is a hero. But if you can't reach out to someone in your family, because I know how difficult it is, because, again, you feel like you're going to be judged, and they're always going to be looking at you sideways. Try to find someone who you can talk to, a family, whether it's a friend, a co-worker, someone. But, again, sometimes I've had this happen to me numerous times, a total stranger. Because I guess sometimes with a stranger, you just feel like, okay, they don't know much about me. They don't know much about my journey. I feel like I won't be judged. And I have helped numerous people who are total strangers to get help when they're suicidal. So I urge you, if you can't talk to someone, that should be your first line of defense, your family, if you feel comfortable. But if you can't, and you don't have a friend, you don't have a coworker, someone you don't really feel comfortable opening up to, I urge you again to reach out to the National Suicide Hotline. And if you don't feel like talking to them straight off the bat, I saw a report that said that when youth reach out when they're in crisis, only 5% call the National Suicide Hotline. The rest text. So you can text help, hope, talk to 741-741. They're going to hit you right back and starting that journey. And for people, and I'll say this too, because I know, especially with people of color right now, We don't even want to think about calling the police, especially African Americans. But I will say, as a suicide survivor, as someone who has depression, if I was in crisis and I couldn't reach some of my lifelines, I don't have a problem with reaching out and asking for a CIT officer, a crisis intervention team officer. I work with the officers over here in Charlotte. I do a lot of work with them. I educate people on them. And I'm telling you, CIT officers, it's not about taking us to jail. It's not about hurting us. It's about de-escalation, making sure that we get that help. Because, see, you don't see it on television, the officer, because we don't talk about suicide and the media doesn't report it. You don't see all the work that these CIT officers do, helping save lives, helping people get the resources. So, again, find someone, even if it's a stranger, to call, but make sure you reach out to someone. Because the thing is with, if you're having those suicidal thoughts and you're alone and you're isolated, those thoughts can become action, and it can happen pretty quickly. So please don't sit there and think, oh, they'll go away, I'll be okay. Please reach out to someone, and you can get the help and you can get better. But don't just sit there and say, well, it'll pass. Because even if it does go away, it can come right back, and then the next time you might not have the opportunity to really reach out on your own to get that help.
I have another question for the panel. Is there free outpatient counseling for those who do not have medical insurance?
Yeah, so I'll be happy to answer that. Yes, there are funding streams available to help that for folks that don't have insurance, and there are certain grants as well. And so that is a possibility. If that is the case and you know somebody, you can have them contact Partners Hope Line or Access to Care, and they can facilitate that.
And the next question, I had a friend who started off harming themselves before they attempted to take their life. Is this a normal first step that is seen in all cases? Should this always be considered a warning sign of possible pending attempt at taking their life?
I can say something about that. In the QPR training, we talk about some of those signs, and that can be a sign of self-destructive behavior where someone is hurting themselves, whether it's cutting themselves. You know, they could get in a car and do 100 miles an hour down the highway. They can get out here and do something where the police can get involved. We've all heard of suicide by cop. They might be drinking heavily and mixing pills. So if it's signs like that, then that's where you need to really start asking that person, are you okay? What's going on with you? How can I help you? Things like that, because it's, when they start doing things like that, they might be having the thought of suicide in their heads. And also, we all know that alcohol, they always call it liquid courage. They always call it liquid courage. And sometimes when people are drinking or self-medicating and they're not in their right frame of mind, that can give them the thoughts of, hey, I can really do this. It can kind of boost them to do something. So if they're cutting themselves or doing self-destructive behavior, you also need to talk to them and see what's going on and see about helping them to get help.
And I'll just add to that, too, the question of, is this a normal first step that is seen in all cases? It's definitely not seen in all cases. Like Fonda just mentioned, it's absolutely a sign that someone needs help, and it's definitely something that should prompt you to ask them and to start that conversation about if they have had, or if they are having thoughts of ending their life. And that's something I used to emphasize a bit more. Was instead of just asking somebody if they've thought of hurting themselves, of actually focusing on, have you actually thought of ending your life, of killing yourself? Because it can be a sign that someone is thinking of suicide, and it can also be something separate. It's definitely an increased risk factor, but for some people, it's also a coping mechanism, and that's something for someone to explore, in therapy, and definitely get treatment for that, because there is treatment and help available for that. But it's absolutely a risk factor, but it's definitely not seen in all situations of someone who has thought about or has attempted suicide.
Okay, I have another question. Do you guys have any kind of materials that in the local, that you put out at the local parks? We did have a attempted suicide in one of our parks last year, and one of our recreation commissioners mentioned that we should have a sign up of where to get help at. Do you see that in other park facilities? Any kind of signage about suicide prevention or anything?
Well, I will say that we have a parking deck here in Charlotte, North Carolina, that I didn't even know that we had people dying in the parking deck. And a reporter friend of mine came to me and told me that the parking deck right across the street from where the Charlotte Hornets play, that we had that many suicides. I did not know until a story was done that we had 6 suicides in 4 years in that parking deck. And when she told me that the news station would let her do a story, I said, well, we can't leave it like it is. So I went to the parking deck management, and I asked them, could we put signage up in the parking decks to save lives? I said, words can hurt, but words can heal. And I said, I want to use my wristband, what I wear every day that I design, I want to turn it into signs. It's very simple, because when we're in crisis, we don't need a whole bunch of wording. We just need the basics and knowing where to get help. So I came up with a sign that says, you're not alone, need help, call the National Suicide Hotline, 800-273-8255, or text help to 741-741. I was able to get those signs up in that parking deck. And then I went on to other parking decks, including the big one across the street from where the Carolina Panthers play, and all over Charlotte. And I'm really proud to say Atrium Health, they're putting them up in all of their parking decks. So maybe that is something that you can put, because when somebody goes up to that parking deck, the one that we had 6 suicides in 4 years, the last one happened in last March before my signs went up. When you see that sign, you know someone understands, because you're saying, you're not alone. I understand what you're going through. And then the help is right there. The sign is green. It's the same color as my wristband, because that sign, the green, is for mental health, and it stands for hope. And it's, like I said, the sign is very simple. It has a suicide prevention number on it and the suicide text, and it lets you know that somebody understands, because it's saying you're not alone. So maybe that's something that you might want to think about putting up. And if you want to talk about that, later, I can. But I, as I said before, words can hurt and words can heal. And I know that my signs are saving lives, and that's the most important thing.
I have a question. What would be the last resort when trying to help a friend to prevent suicide? Can you, like, for example, or a family member, say, for example, if they don't feel like they're suicidal, that everything's okay, but their demeanor and everything else seems to appear otherwise, is there any court order that you could get them to, to actually physically go and seek help or admit them?
Mel, you could probably answer this as well, but as far as when you're talking about a court order and going to the magistrate, that is an option. But as part of that, you need to explain to the magistrate and convince them that that person is an imminent threat to themselves or others before they will physically kind of take them. Probably a better option if they do look look like there's that's where I think maybe calling global crisis or calling some of the lines that we provided might assist you in finding a way to connect them to treatment. But once you start talking about sort of forcing treatment, that then you're looking at a court order from a magistrate, and that can take you have to show a threshold of severity. Melanie, you can probably speak better to that than I know.
This is Fonda. That's what happened to me 25 years ago, and that's why, again, I keep emphasizing that my Aunt Kelly was a hero and is to this day, because when I called her, I had a plan. I was going to take some pills and wash it down with alcohol, and I don't drink, smoke, never done drugs. And I called my Aunt Kelly, and I told her she could have my shoes. Now, she could have said, she's having a bad day. She's just wanting some attention, because I hear that a lot in African Americans. She's just having a bad day, or she'd never do that. She didn't do that. I told her she could have my shoes. So I didn't come out directly and say I was going to kill myself. We hung up. My Aunt Kelly called me right back, and she asked me, "Are you going to kill yourself?" And I told her yes. Again, she could have said, well, she's just having a bad day. I'll leave her alone. But she didn't do that. She went. I was living in Charlotte. She came over here to Charlotte. She had the papers drawn up, and I didn't get to implement my plan that day. And about later on that afternoon, a CMPD officer was at my door, and he said, "I'm here to take you to Cedar Springs." And so she had me involuntarily committed, and I was hot with her. I was so mad. But I always tell people when I'm training, you have two choices. You can get us help, and we might be mad at you. We might not ever speak to you again, but we're allowed to not speak. Or you can do nothing, and you can live with that guilt that if that person dies by suicide and you could have done something to save them, you have to live with that. My Aunt Kelly went up against my mother and my grandmother to save my life. And something, too, if we go into crisis and you're around us, and this is something I teach in the training, don't put your hands on us when we're in crisis, because we're not thinking clearly. We might be in a psychosis kind of state. We're afraid. It's like an animal backed into a corner. Don't put your hands on us. Stand at a distance, talk to us in a kind and reassuring way, and let us know, I'm going to help you. We're going to get through this. You can get better. Because when that police officer put his hands on me, because I know the first thing you want to do with somebody is to go and hug them and let them know, I care about you, I love you. But when we're in crisis, you can't do that, because we're not thinking clearly. And when that police officer put his hand on my shoulder, I scratched him. And when I scratched him, he grabbed me by the back of my neck, he shook me really hard, and he threw me in handcuffs. And the only thing that saved me from getting hurt that day was my 12-year-old son was standing there, and he said, "Mom, please calm down." So if someone goes into crisis, don't put your hands on them, and you might have to call for a paramedic or the crisis mobile unit or a CIT officer, but also recognize that if someone says they're going to hurt themselves or they're going to kill themselves, you have to act, and you don't worry about us getting mad at you. You just worry about saving our lives, and we'll worry about the rest of that stuff down the road.
Thank you, Ms. Fonda. That was awesome.
You're welcome.
And right now we don't have any more questions, but we'll wait just a few more minutes and see if we get anybody else to ask them the questions. Okay, everyone. I think there was some good information from the presiders, and I think it was well. I learned a lot myself, and I hope that the people that participated learned something also. And I really want to thank the people who gave the presentations, their time and effort for coming out on a Friday afternoon. It was, to me, it was worthwhile doing it. So I really appreciate you guys coming out. We will have this recorded on our CLM.org website for other people to go out and view. I think up to us and the community. So we really appreciate you guys coming out. And with that,
thank you for having us. I really appreciate it, and I hope that people will take to heart what we said. And just remember that you're not alone. There's help out there. There's always hope, and you can get help, and you can recover and lead a good life. You really can. I do it every day for the most part.
we really thank Millie, Andrew. And with that, we'll end this workshop. Thanks a lot, everyone.
Thank you.